Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of my game tutorial lecture series. I am Jason Bulmahn, the director of game design at Paizo and the creator of the Pathfinder role-playing game, and today, what I'd like to talk to you all about is the art of prepping a published adventure, putting together a published adventure and getting it ready to run for your game group. Listen, being a GM is hard work. You have to juggle monsters and stats and players and all the rules of the game. It can be daunting. And as a result, many of us turn to published adventures. I certainly do, and many of you do as well, to help fill in your campaign. I know some folks who run entirely published adventures, and that's all they run, right? I mean, Paizo itself makes an entire business model out of selling published adventures. But there's a difference between just cracking open a published adventure and just running it encounter by encounter, and then doing a little bit of prep time to get yourselves ready to fully run it, to make it a fun and immersive experience for everyone at the table. I think that there are a number of tricks and tips that I have picked up over the years from amazing game masters and amazing storytellers that they use when modifying and adapting a published adventure that I'd like to share with all of you. So let's get started here. Part one, and I just realized I didn't do my, I usually have little titles down in the corner, but I actually didn't put them together for this. I totally spaced. I was too busy watching a stream about Klingons. So part one is all about mapping the module. So the first step really is reading through the adventure. And this is more than just understanding what's on the page. It's about mapping how the adventure is actually designed to flow. Like your first step, and I know this is obvious, right, is just reading it. But I'm not talking about like sitting down and reading every encounter word for word. What I'm really trying to say here is what you're trying to do is take in the structure of the adventure itself. So the first thing you want to do is try and get a hold of what the main plot is. Who's the main villain? What are they up to? How are they accomplishing it? How do the players interact with it? The usual stuff. I certainly have plenty of this on building adventures and building villains and stuff like that. So if you want more of that information, you can find it in some of my other videos here on my YouTube channel. But you're going to want to look at the adventure to find out what the primary plot is and what the secondary plots are, right? How do they all weave together? How do they work? That's kind of the most basic thing that you do when you start your read through. But I think, the next thing you want to do is look at how the adventure is broken down. And for this seminar, I'm going to be giving examples from the Fall of Plaguestone. So if you are in the middle of playing this adventure and don't want any spoilers, I'll try and keep it as spoiler light as possible, but you may just want to skip. So you want to look at how the adventure segments down its various components. And these are usually really important because they not only serve for the author to be able to compartmentalize parts of the story in a way that's easily digestible, they often serve as interesting transition points and shifts in tone and action and location. So these are usually really obvious. They're usually pretty clearly demarcated within a published adventure, but they aren't always. Some of the old classic adventures would just roll from one segment to the other, and they would just literally be like, here are all the maps and everything, all the locations are just listed, and you had to intuit the overall plot line by reading the locations. I think most modern adventures start with a plot synopsis, and then they break down how the rest of the adventure is structured so that you can have a better sense of how it works. But in either case, when you're giving it a read through, you're going to want to look at how the adventure segments itself. If you look at Plaguestone, it starts out with a lengthy segment in town, and then follows that up with a segment out in the wilderness, then follows it up with another segment out in the hinterlands, right? And each one of these three segments offers up a very different style of play and a different kind of feel and vibe to them. Each one has a different GMing style that you would apply to each section. And fundamentally, each also offers very different ways for the PCs to interact with them and solve them. And when you read it, that, I hope anyway, that comes across. But that's what you're going to be looking for, is how does the plot break down and how does it segment. You're going to want to figure out what the purpose of each segment is. What are they trying to convey to the players in that segment of the story? What's the key pieces of information? What's the key encounters? Is the segment more regimented? Is it a lot more of a linear series of encounters, or is it more loose and freeform where the players can kind of explore and experience it in whatever way they want? You're going to want to start mapping these things to your understanding of the story. And all of this is, just doing preparation to pay dividends later on. So you're going to want to think about how each segment calls upon the GM's skills. Are there segments that are particularly more freeform? Are there segments that rely on GM improv or free play more than others? I think, if you look at some parts of Plaguestone, there are some parts that are obviously very regimented because they take place on a dungeon map and they're a series of encounters linked by hallways. The players can't really decide to change the narrative over much there. I mean, players will always find a way, but on the whole, the GM is just there pretty much as a referee as the players versus the encounters. Whereas the first segment is entirely much more freeform. The players might interact with the various components in vastly different ways. Their approach to situations will change how those situations resolve. That's very different than the later sections. And you're going to want to identify those very early on in your read-through. You're going to want to pay special attention to the transitions and how the players are expected to get from one part to the other. These are things that are usually pretty critical. These are like bottlenecks or focus points in the story where the action or the narrative has to pass through this for everything to make sense. This is usually true in transition from place to place. If you're running, the village of Hamlet and that leads to the moat house, the fact that they find out where the moat house is and how to get there or tasked going there is the transitional piece that they need, picking up the job and being asked to go out there. That is a key moment, and you kind of need that or something like it to get the story to progress. This is also certainly true in Plaguestone as the players learn the location of some of the sinister forces that are acting against them and then have now a place to go. They can't be expected to go there because they don't know where it is until that moment. I'm talking about the end of the kind of first part when you leave town. You're going to want to look at the challenges. How are they distributed? Are there parts of the adventure that are pretty much just there for role-playing? Are there parts that are very combat-heavy? Are there parts that there are mixes? Where are the major fights? Like, for the levels that the players are expected to be, are there moments that you're like, that's one of the harder fights, that's one of the harder fights? And how many of those are lined up with transitions? Very frequently in adventure, the transitions and the harder fights are aligned. You'll go through one of the harder fights, and then that'll mark the transition to a different phase of the story. These are useful tricks for those of us writing adventures to give those moments a special feeling of gravity and weight because it was a harder fight. That is a way to signal to both the players and the GM that this was important. That doesn't mean, of course, that it can't also be something that they find in the pocket of a kobold that, died from dysentery on the side of the road, right? I mean, also possible. You're going to want to, in addition to looking at the challenges, you're going to want to look at treasure as well. Where are the big caches of treasure? Where are the big rewards in the adventure? Once again, these are usually clustered around the transitions as well, but they're not always. Sometimes one of the most valuable things you might find in a dungeon is just in the middle of their exploration of it. That way they have it to use at the end. In any case, in your read-through, you're going to want to note where these things are. And I'm not talking about actually sit down and write notes, although if that helps you, by all means do so. It's just more of, as you read through it, going, yes, this is the spot. And just keeping it in mind as you pull together all the assembled details of the adventure. Finally, you're going to want to check and see if there are any new rules systems or rules components that need to be learned or mastered before the adventure begins. Are there new monsters? Are there new magic items? Are there new spells? That's kind of the easy stuff. Are there new entire subsystems you need to learn? Oh, this uses the victory point system. I need to go learn that. Oh, this has a chase in it, and it uses the chase mechanics. I need to go make sure I know those. Those are things you're going to want to identify in your read-through, because the last thing you're going to want to do in play is stop all the action at that critical juncture and then go read the rule system, then come back and educate it. You don't want to do that at the table. I don't want to do that at the table. The players don't want you to do that at the table. Best to figure it out beforehand and just make sure you're familiar enough with it so that even if you do have to open the book, nothing wrong with that, you at least know what you're looking for and it all comes back to you quickly. So, to sum up, mapping the module. I do have this ready. Totally spaced on putting together my little card in the corner. I'm so sad. Let's talk about mapping the module. Read the adventure. What's the primary plot? Are there any side plots? How is the adventure broken up? In what segments is it broken into? What's the purpose of each segment? What is it trying to accomplish? What's the tone and tenor of each segment? How much of it relies on GM improv? Pay attention to the transitions. Where does the action change? When does the location change? How does the story move from one scene to the next? How are the challenges distributed? Where do you find the big fights? How are they clustered? Are there parts of the adventure that has a lot of fights? Are there parts that have very little? Where's the treasure at? Similarly, where is all the loot and reward? And then finally, are there any new rules to master or systems to learn and adapt to? All right, that's part one. Let's move on to part two of the adventure here, and this is anticipating your player characters, because part one is reading the adventure. The other part is looking at the group that you have and thinking about how they're going to respond to this adventure to make sure that you can anticipate any rough spots or any opportunities that might exist. So, I think a GM, this is two facets of the GM's toolkit. One facet is knowing the adventure. The other facet is knowing the players and being able to predict what they might do or what they might, how they might respond to any given encounters. Now, obviously, and I'm seeing this in chat flowing down the screen, is folks saying, yeah, players are always the wild card. And it's true, because players will oftentimes do things that you do not expect. However, I think that all of us have had player characters that you can look at the characters and go, yeah, I have a pretty good idea of how this character is going to interact with the situation. Or, this character really has a dislike for bartenders, and this adventure relies on them getting information out of a bartender, so this is going to be a problem. What can I do to either anticipate it, play it up, or avoid it, because it's going to cause a problem with the campaign. So let's... What I'm doing here is trying to arm you with all the tools about understanding how to change and adapt your adventure. The players are the other half of that. So you need to think about, what can your players do really well? What are their key competencies, right? If we're talking about most fantasy role-playing game adventures, D&D, Pathfinder, that sort of stuff, and to be honest, this really applies to most role-playing games, all of them have segmented roles for the various characters. Oh, this character is really good at fighting, this character is really good at sneaking, this character is really good at talking to people, this character is really good at spells, this character is really good at hacking. There's all different kinds of niches that characters can have, and as a result, each group tends to be a mix of what niches in the campaign they are particularly good at. And you're going to want to look at, say, okay, what are my player characters really good at? And then you're going to want to look at the adventure, because you've already read the plot, and say, are there significant spots in here where the players will be challenged? Are there spots where their forte will be allowed to shine? This isn't about looking for, the group's really good at dealing with traps, so I'm not going to bother including any of the traps in this adventure. No, that's the opposite way of thinking. You should definitely include the traps in the adventure. They've invested in being good at taking care of traps. You should let them flex those skills. right? Allowing the players to flex is an important part of the story. That said, you also want to look and make sure that it's not an adventure that relies on traps, in this example, for all of its challenges. So if you're telling, if the group is, it's 6 rogues and they just destroy every trap that they come upon, you basically, they're a bunch of burglars and they break into places and steal stuff and deal with traps all the time, and you're about to run a published adventure that relies on traps for half of its challenge. Well, you now have an adventure that might be fun for them to play, but they're not actually going to feel very challenged by it. I think that's an important thing to know. And then conversely, what are the players lacking? They don't have every specialty. No group really does. So does the adventure present challenges that are either that are going to be interesting for them to try and find a way to navigate because they don't have the right skills? And this is also the point where you want to look and say, okay, is there a potential TPK weighting, total party kill, because of something that is coming up in this adventure? It's the opposite. This group has no rogue. They have no one who can pick a trap. The way that they survive traps is the barbarian's hit points. And how do I deal with an adventure that has one location in the middle of this dungeon that if you can't disarm the trap at all, it will kill the whole party? Well, that's a bit of a challenge, right? You're going to want to think about that. You're going to want to look at ways in the adventure to either forecast the problem and give them tools to solve it, or you're going to want to look to give them another way to get out of it. Maybe the adventure doesn't include rules for smashing the door down and breaking out of the trapped room, but I can guarantee you that's going to be what the party thinks of the moment they realize what kind of hot water they're in. You're going to want to think about your players' personalities, their attitudes, their general dispositions, and how those are going to interact with the adventure. Do any of their quirks or personalities suggest a problem that they're going to face? I think this most often comes in the form of a character that has an extreme dislike for I really dislike, from before, I really dislike barkeeps. My dad was a barkeep and he was a terrible person, so I don't like barkeeps at all. And the adventure revolves around getting information from this barkeep and helping this barkeep who's supposed to be sympathetic. Well, if one of the characters hates barkeeps, that's either going to be a problem or an opportunity, depending on how they tend to handle it. I think you're trying to forecast out problems, and you're also trying to look for opportunities. So, if you've got a character in your group that hates, say, orphans or horses, as I have had running the crazy folks from the Glass Cannon podcast, putting in opportunities for them to deal with a horse is a fun and exciting part of the adventure. It's also something that you have to think about delicately, right? If the players get their horses killed all the time, and the adventure is there's something about one of the horses that they have to have this horse at the end. Well, now you have a problem. So, there's lots of different things to keep in mind when you're trying to gauge the player characters' personalities and quirks. And ultimately, that can be both really frustrating at times, but it can also be very rewarding if you think about it and come up with solutions that are fun and engaging. You're also going to want to look for ways to make the adventure personal. This comes in a variety of different ways. It can come from the hook having something to do intrinsically with the PCs and their background, or it can come from the PCs themselves and their background and their story being worked into the adventure. For Plaguestone, I do this work for you. I include a bunch of backgrounds that the characters are encouraged to take, and the backgrounds themselves have ties in the adventure, so that their characters are kind of intrinsically set up to have moments in the adventure that make sense for their character and give their character an interesting hook to interact with. If that's not in the adventure you're playing, it's not hard to set these things up yourself. It's all about looking at the characters and finding ways to twist or alter the encounters that are in the adventure to make sense for them. It then suddenly feels more personal. It doesn't feel as much like you just are reading out of an adventure, and no matter what they do, their characters are just kind of replaceable pieces. I honestly think this is one of the biggest challenges of running a published adventure, is that from the player's perspective, it can feel like they are the interchangeable pawn here, and the adventure is this unchanging monolith that they get to experience. That has benefits and drawbacks, but a good GM can really mitigate a lot of those drawbacks and make the adventure really speak to the characters that are at the table. So all of these points of analysis are places where, combined with your knowledge of the adventure map, you can be looking for, spots where you can make adjustments, where you can scribble out some notes beforehand about how you might want to change or alter the adventure for the players. But they're also just, in some cases, things that you just have to keep in mind. That you just have to understand, hey, the players might really engage with this particular red herring in the plot because of something that happened to them in their past. They might think I'm being cheeky and adding an Easter egg that then leads them somewhere, but in reality, that was just a coincidence in the adventure that they're going to latch onto, and now they're off track. Understanding where these things are and making sure that you've got, your toolkit is filled with options and alternatives to kind of navigate the story is really quite important. So, to sum up, the second step, anticipating your PCs. So, knowing your PCs is critical to running a good published adventure. Understanding what they can do really well as a group, and does the adventure challenge them? Does it offer things that are actually challenging for them in that arena? I think that's always interesting, but you have to be careful, because if not everyone in the group is hyper-focused on that same thing, they are going to find that encounter very, very, very frustrating. I always like to think of it this way. If I'm running an adventure for somebody who always hits because they've focused everything on accuracy, if I put an encounter in that challenges them, that has an AC so high that they don't hit all the time, the other characters that didn't do that never hit. And for them, that encounter is incredibly frustrating. The character who made the hyper-focused character may feel challenged finally, but everyone else feels like it's a slog. There are better ways around that. There just are. It's about giving that person someone to fight while giving everyone else someone to fight as well, right? There's lots of different ways that you can look at how the adventure is structured to make those challenges interesting. Are there anything that the PCs as a group lack? Are there any fights that are unwinnable because of, their skill set? You're going to want to look to find other ways to get them out of that, or to forecast the danger. That way they don't go blindly wandering into an area where suddenly they feel like they got railroaded into a no-win scenario. Do the PC personalities play a part? How will they interact with the story and the characters in it? Make the adventure personal. Include PC backstories when possible. Tie them into the backstory. Tie them into the hook. That's always a great way to make the entire adventure feel like it's about them. Use all of these points when analyzing the plot to see if there are any spots that need polish and revision. That's what this is all about. That's step 1 and 2 is all about getting yourself ready so that when you run it, it's as smooth as possible. So, that is going to bring us to part 3. Adjusting and playing the adventure on the fly. So prep can only take you so far. Everyone in chat is right. Ultimately, the biggest risk in running the adventure is adjusting it at the table and making sure it all runs smoothly. That's the biggest task that the GM has. The players are going to interact with it in whatever way they come up with. And as GM, you have to constantly be modifying and adapting on the fly to make the adventure fun. So parts 1 and 2, mapping the adventure, understanding your player characters, seeing how they're going to interact, that's mostly a thought exercise about, you do kind of simultaneously while you're reading it. But all of that is just kind of setup. You're just building a toolkit so that when you run the adventure, you have as many tools as possible to make sure that it's fun and you don't have to stop the action to come up with solutions to what the players do. This also gives you the luxury of spending that time while players are figuring out their dice rolls and stuff to invent new and exciting opportunities that you can see coming together. I think one of the moments from Knights of Everflame that I found most rewarding was when Liz decided to go and speak with Angela's father. I think it was during episode 4 or 5 during season 1. And while they were chatting, I suddenly realized I had an opportunity to introduce something that might be pivotal later, and it ended up being that way. But that was never in my script. The only reason I was able to do that is because I knew the characters so well, I knew the story so well, that I was able to ad-lib those sorts of things. Now, obviously, this is an adventure I wrote, not a published adventure, but the process is still the same. Knowing the adventure and knowing the characters really well gives you as GM a luxury of time behind the screen to ad-lib and make changes on the fly and write notes and prevent yourself from spending all of your time in a book staring at rules or paging through the adventure trying to find the answer that you don't yet have because you haven't read ahead. So, I think when adjusting the adventure, when playing the adventure and adjusting it on the fly, you're going to want to go back to your map first and understand where the adventure has critical turning points and narrow lanes that the players must follow for the story to make sense. I think this is one of the most critical skills, is about understanding where the choke points in the story are that the players have to do for the rest of the story to make sense. If you were looking at Plaguestone, there is a moment where they uncover a map and they get a piece of information about where a reference point in the map is. They need both of those pieces of information for the rest of the adventure to make sense, for them to make the next step to part 2. And if they don't get those things, then I have a real problem because the adventure doesn't move forward. And I think that is really important because sometimes your players will miss things. They will not go into the room that has the thing that you really need them to get. Now, as a GM, you could just be like, yeah, I guess you didn't find everything. I mean, you didn't explore the whole dungeon, so I guess you'll just go back to town and wait and see what happens. And I've done that as a GM. We all have. Where you just let the players stew in their own choices because they didn't find the critical thing. And there are points where that is the right option. They shouldn't be rewarded with the second half of the adventure if they stop halfway through the first part and just don't go any further, right? There are ways to prod them on that. But if they miss one fine point detail because the adventure doesn't make a very good point of it, and they just don't catch it and move on to the next part and then get confused, well, you as GM need to recognize that and find a way to fix it. Now, in many cases, this is as simple as just kind of giving them a nudge in the right direction. But in other cases, you actually have to rework parts of the adventure, right? If they miss the map in the first part of Plaguestone, well, I need to find a way to get that to them. I could stuff it in a pocket, I could put it in a different box, there's a lot of different ways I can fix that problem, but it still needs to be fixed, because if not, the players are entirely lost. Now, just as there are parts that are very strict and very narrow in an adventure's story, and the way that the players interact with it, there are other parts that are going to be very flexible and have a lot of improv in them. These parts are generally more freeform, where the players have their kind of choice of how they interact with things, maybe even a choice of order. These, can be as wide open as something like, this part of the adventure is Hexploration, and we're going to go explore this entire big map. Well, in that case, you really, as GM, are just responding to whatever the players do and making sure to keep it exciting. There are others that are a little bit more strict, Plaguestone has a section pretty early on, for example, where the players are required to go talk to a whole bunch of people to get to the bottom of a mystery. And as a result, it's kind of a web. They can do a lot of things, but really there are X number of things that they need to do to advance the story. And what order they decide to do them in really kind of dictates how the adventure comes together. When I playtested it, they went to the right location, like, as their second choice. And as a result, that part of the adventure was very short. I ran it for a different group and they did it in the opposite order, and for them that part of the adventure took forever because they went through all these other pieces. Both of those are fine solutions because eventually they got to where they needed to go. But when you're in those parts of the adventure, this is also when, as a GM, you should be mindful of the fact that the players might decide to go in an entirely different direction at all, right? They might go completely off the beaten path. And as GM, you have to make sure that you're on your toes for those sorts of things. There are going to be points in time where it's fine to just kind of block them and be like, yeah, you go talk to that person, but it's clear they don't know anything about it. What do you do next, right? I've done that. You can certainly do that. But there are other points where, especially if they've missed something and all of a sudden they're wandering off in the wrong direction, where putting the clue back in their path, even though they missed it in a previous spot, is the right answer. And you're going to want to look for opportunities to do that. In many cases, those kind of wider open parts of an adventure script are pretty flexible in how they play out. But again, knowing how all of this works throughout the story is critical, right? If they if they're going around trying to get a clue off of someone, and the person that they get the clue off of has to be the one that has it because he's the king's cousin, and it turns but no one knows this, and him having the clue later proves his guilt or something, right? Then you can't just give the clue to somebody else. So it's all about understanding where you can do those things and where you can skip those things and move things around. Again, comes back to knowing your story and knowing your players. I feel like I'm repeating that mantra a lot, but it is ultimately very true. You're also going to look, especially as the game is playing on, what parts they miss. A lot of adventures are generally pretty tight on their encounter budgets and their treasure budgets, especially if you're running, kind of your standard fantasy role-playing games. I think, those encounters and treasure that are missed might, if they pile up enough, might make it so that at the end of the adventure, the players are not where they're supposed to be. Now, there are some GMs out there that are like, tough. If the end is harder because you didn't do everything, that's on you. And I can understand that, but I can also understand that sometimes the adventure isn't constructed in a way that encourages them to get all of the XP and get all of the treasure before the end, right? If there's a dragon slaying sword in one treasure pile and they missed that treasure pile, and now the final encounter is at TPK because they didn't pick up the one thing that was in a side room that they didn't go in, you can blame that on the players, but I think you're kind of wasting your time. I think the adventure didn't do a very good job of making sure that they got the tools they needed to get to the end. The inverse is also true, right? If you're being flexible on things and ad-libbing in an encounter or two and throwing in a little extra treasure because it makes sense, those things can pile up too, and then the end can be too easy, right? Because the players approach it with too many tools, or they have too many things at their disposal that allow them to kind of crush the end encounter without having, faced everything else. They faced some extra stuff. So, it's a give and a take. Whenever you're looking at ways to adjust the module, I like to do kind of some of each. If they miss some encounters, I'll add some encounters. Just so that at the end, everything kind of comes out in the wash. And the easiest way to do this, to be honest, is just to literally pick up the encounters and throw them in a different context. They didn't make it to the room of the dungeon that had trolls in it, and they're in the next segment, and boy, they sure are going to miss some of that XP. So on the road from A to Z, they run into those same two trolls, who happen to also have the same treasure in the room that they were supposed to be encountered in. It's a real easy way to kit bash things together, and big secret, your players will never know the difference. Alright, so to sum up, part 3, modules in play. Prep can only take you so far. Much of your adjustment will happen at the table. You're going to want to look at your map of the adventure and determine what parts of the adventure are critical. This is all about identifying choke points. These are usually your transition points. If you remember in part 1, I said pay attention to those. Now you know why you want to pay attention to those. Because those transition points are really quite critical, usually. They are... You get from A to B because of some clue, or because of some breadcrumb, or because of some chase. You will still need to have those in the adventure, even if the players do part 1 entirely different than the module expects. What parts are freeform? What parts can the players do in whatever order they want, and that's perfectly fine. Most adventures have some segment of these. I think Plaguestone actually starts very freeform and gets more and more constrained as you go along. It gets less freeform the closer you get to the end. To some extent, that is by design, to kind of leave the players with lots of choices early on and then narrow them into the funnel that leads toward the end of the adventure. That was an intentional design choice. But as GM, when you're reading through these things, you're going to want to identify how that works so that you can make sure to convey it in the right way. Where can you improv? Where can you just make stuff up? What parts of the adventure can you go, you know what? The players are having so much fun with this, I think I'll extend it. It's easy to do. The players are really having a good time in this town. They've technically done everything they're supposed to do in this town. They're supposed to move on, but they decide to stay for another couple days and explore some of the interesting NPCs. It's not necessarily going to cost you anything, but if they then have some fights and do some interesting stuff while they're doing this, you're going to want to look at spots later on in the adventure to trim things up a little bit to keep them at the same spot. So this gets back to keeping an eye on missed encounters and be mindful what you add here, these two last parts. Tracking what they miss, tracking what you add, making sure all those things kind of roughly balance out. It's not mandatory. You can also take the other route, which is, they've missed a bunch of encounters, or I've added a bunch, and they're either higher level or lower level than they're supposed to be. So I'll actually adjust the final encounters or the end of the adventure to make sense. I think you will find that is far more work than just making sure that they end up where they're supposed to be. Take it from me, I've been doing this for years. Adjusting their path to get to the end is a lot easier than adjusting the entire back end to make sense for where their path finally led them. Depends. I think that's mostly true. I think if they're right near the end and they happen to be a little off, it's probably easier to adjust 1 or 2 encounters, but not going to happen very often. Yeah, and I know some of you use milestone leveling, so none of this matters. But not everybody does. Not everybody does. Some people still use XP, like suckers. All right, let's go to slide 3 here. And oh, wait, I just did this. Yes. All right. Very good. Okay. So, running a published adventure can be a very thrilling and memorable experience. I think all of us have stories, about being a part of published adventures. In fact, they're one of the big things that makes gaming such a great community. I can go to a show, when we have shows again, and talk to folks about their experiences playing Plaguestone, or their experiences playing Temple of Elemental Evil, or really any, memorable published adventure, and everybody can immediately share a tale that's relatable to everyone at the table who's played that adventure. That's something special about gaming. I think we can all sit around and talk about what, we liked about a movie or what we liked about a book, but there's a difference here in that when it comes to an adventure, when it comes to a published module, you're talking about how you solved it. You're bringing your unique experience to the discussion, and that makes it really special. I think this is why published adventures really are a key and critical component of the larger tabletop hobby. It really is part of our experience that we can share with others, that they can then relate to automatically. They just can. They have their own version of that same story, and that's really something special. But to make that work as a GM, you really do have to put in more than just reading the adventure. It takes some critical thinking. It takes some analyzing of your group. I'm not saying that you won't still have a good time if you just read it as you go along. You certainly can. I don't want to stress that, prep is the only way to run a successful adventure. It's not. But it doesn't hurt. You're only making it an easier, smoother process. Gives you a bonus on that craft good game session check. And really, that's what, as GM, your day is really all about. So I think that about covers it up. For those of you hanging out here in my chat, as this is live on Twitch, stay tuned. We're going to do a live Q&A about this here starting up in just a moment. For those of you watching this as a replay on YouTube, thank you for watching. This channel has really been a joy for me over the past few months, and I really do appreciate all of you who have come by and stopped in to watch my videos. If you haven't watched them all, they're all in a convenient playlist here on design lectures or game lectures here on my YouTube channel, and you can catch those. And if you want to catch up with me more, you can find me on Twitter, on Facebook, on Twitch, on Instagram, here on YouTube, all at /Jason Bulmahn. That's JASON BULMAHN. Thank you for watching, everybody, and we will see you next time.